Emma, sweetie, don't worry about the prices here. Your father and I will take care of your meals since we know money is tight for you right now. My mother's voice carried across the white linen tablecloth at Meridian, loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over with that particular expression of polite discomfort that people wear when they're accidentally witnessing someone else's humiliation. I felt my fingers tighten around the stem of my water glass, the familiar heat of shame creeping up my neck. And I wanted to say something, wanted to correct her, but the words stuck in my throat the way they always did, when my family decided who I was without bothering to ask. My father nodded in agreement, cutting into his $48 filet mignon with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own narrative about anything, least of all his younger daughter. "It's important to help family," he said, and I heard the unspoken end of that sentence as clearly as if he'd shouted it, especially the ones who can't help themselves. Across from me, my brother Marcus smirked into his wineglass, a Napa Cabernet he'd made a show of ordering, explaining the vintage to our parents like he was some kind of sommelier instead of exactly what he was, which was a 31-year-old man who had never had to prove himself because he'd been born first and male and willing to do exactly what our parents wanted. I looked down at my own plate, at the seared scallops I'd barely touched, and felt the weight of 28 years pressing down on my shoulders. This dinner was supposed to be a celebration, though I couldn't remember what we were celebrating, or maybe I'd never asked because it didn't really matter. Family dinners were always the same script with different settings, the same roles we'd all been playing since I was 18, and told my parents I wanted to study computer science instead of business management, that I wanted to build something different than the Chen family real estate empire that my grandfather had started and my father had expanded and Marcus was being groomed to inherit. I'd watched my mother's face fall when I said the word engineering, watched my father's jaw tighten when I mentioned Stanford, and I'd known even then that I was choosing a path that would lead me away from them, though I hadn't understood yet how far that distance would stretch or how much it would cost me. But sitting there in that beautiful restaurant with its crystal chandeliers and its discreet lighting and its carefully curated atmosphere of expensive elegance, listening to my mother worry about my finances in front of strangers, I understood that the cost had been my parents' respect, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to earn it back. And the terrible thing was that I still wanted to. Stanford had accepted me with a full academic scholarship that covered tuition, and I'd worked 3 part-time jobs to cover housing and expenses, because when I told my parents I'd gotten in, my father had looked at me across the dinner table in our Palo Alto house and said, "Computer science isn't real work, Emma. It's a fad. And we're not financing a mistake." I remember my mother had nodded in agreement, then turned to Marcus, who was 19 and barely maintaining a C average at Santa Clara University in the business program my father had chosen for him, and asked if he needed anything, if his allowance was enough, if the apartment they were paying for was comfortable. I'd felt something crack inside me that night, some foundational belief about unconditional love or familial support, and I'd gone to Stanford anyway, spent 4 years exhausting myself between classes and shifts at the campus bookstore, and tutoring gigs, and a weekend position at a coffee shop near University Avenue. I graduated with honors, with job offers from 3 major tech companies, with a future I'd built entirely by myself. And my parents didn't come to the ceremony because it was the same weekend as a real estate conference in San Diego that Marcus was attending with my father, his first big professional event, and my mother said, "You understand, don't you, honey? Marcus's career is just getting started, and we need to support him. You'll have other graduations." Except I wouldn't. That was the only undergraduate commencement I'd ever have, and I walked across that stage in my rented cap and gown and looked out at the crowd of proud parents and saw the empty seats where mine should have been sitting. The pattern had been established by then, refined over years into something like a ritual. Marcus bought his first investment property at 23 with a $200,000 gift from our parents, called it a head start and a vote of confidence, and I'd been working at a mid-sized tech firm for 2 years by then, had asked my father once, carefully, if there might be any support available for a down payment on a small condo, and he'd laughed and said, "You wanted independence, Emma. You chose computers over family, so be independent." I'd stopped asking after that, stopped mentioning promotions or projects or achievements because every time I did, my mother would find a way to redirect the conversation to Marcus, to his latest deal or his networking success or his new car. And my father would get this distant look in his eyes like he was disappointed in me for reasons he couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply nonetheless. Family gatherings became performances where I played the role of the wayward daughter who'd made unconventional choices, where aunts and uncles would ask what I did, and my mother would answer before I could, saying, "Oh, Emma works with computers," in a tone that suggested I'd chosen to become a professional gambler or a street mime. The resentment built slowly, year after year, like sediment accumulating at the bottom of a river. And I told myself it didn't matter that I didn't need their approval, but I kept showing up to these dinners anyway, kept hoping something would change even though nothing ever did. I'd been working at Tech Vantage Solutions for 3 years by the time of that dinner, a startup that had grown from 12 people in a cramped office above a bubble tea shop to a 200-person company with Series C funding and actual HR department. And I'd been there since month 6, employee number 43, back when equity packages were generous and the founders were still willing to gamble on young engineers who believed in the vision. My title was Senior Engineering Director now, a promotion I'd received 4 months earlier that came with a team of 15 developers, oversight of 3 major product initiatives, and a salary of $240,000 plus stock options that my financial advisor kept telling me would be worth serious money if the company ever went public. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in the Richmond district, a neighborhood my mother had once described as unfortunate and far from everything important. And I drove a 4-year-old Honda Civic that ran perfectly well despite Marcus's comment last Christmas that it looked like something a college student would drive. My parents had decided somewhere along the way that my modest lifestyle meant financial struggle, that my lack of designer labels and luxury purchases indicated failure rather than choice. And I'd never corrected them because what was the point? Every time I tried to share good news over the years, my mother would smile tightly and change the subject, or my father would nod distractedly and start talking about interest rates or market conditions or something Marcus had accomplished that week. When I'd made senior engineer 2 years ago, I'd mentioned it at Sunday dinner and my mother had said, "That's nice, honey," and then immediately turned to Marcus to ask about his new client, a tech executive buying a $3 million home in Atherton, and my father had spent 20 minutes discussing Marcus's negotiation strategy, while I sat there wondering why I'd bothered to say anything at all. So when the promotion to director came through, when I sat in the conference room with our CEO and COO, and they told me I was getting a 40% raise and a significant equity increase, and a leadership role that would put me in the executive team meetings, I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell them about the equity either, the shares that had vested over 3 years, and the new grant that came with the promotion. Stock that my advisor estimated at somewhere around $400,000 if we achieved even the conservative projections. I kept quiet about all of it because I was tired of my achievements being diminished, tired of watching my father's eyes glaze over when I talked about architecture decisions and scalability challenges, tired of my mother's sympathetic looks that said she thought I was making the best of a bad situation. It was easier to let them think what they wanted to think, to play the role of the struggling daughter who'd made unconventional choices, to avoid the conflict that came whenever I challenged their narrative about who I was supposed to be. My mother had called 3 days before the dinner and insisted we all meet at Meridian, this restaurant in the financial district that she'd heard about from one of her society friends, a place she described as appropriate for a real family occasion, and I'd felt my stomach drop when she named it because I'd been to Meridian at least 30 times over the past 2 years, knew the menu by heart, had my usual table by the window where the evening light caught the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. But I didn't say any of that, because how could I explain without explaining everything else? I'd agreed to meet them at 7 on Saturday, had spent an hour standing in front of my closet trying to decide what to wear, settling finally on a simple navy dress I'd bought at Nordstrom 2 years ago. Nothing designer, no visible labels, the kind of understated elegance that cost more than it looked, but that my mother would inevitably read as trying her best with limited means. I arrived at Meridian at 7:15, intentionally late because being on time meant more minutes of small talk, and walked through the brass doors into the warm lighting and soft murmur of expensive conversations. And Maria at the host stand smiled with recognition before catching herself, understanding somehow that tonight I didn't want to be acknowledged as a regular, and she directed me to the table where my parents and Marcus were already seated in the corner booth, and I could feel my mother's appraising look before I even reached them, that sweeping assessment she'd perfected over the years that could catalog and categorize and judge in 3 seconds flat. "Well, you finally dressed up for once," my mother said as I slid into the booth, and my father glanced up from the wine list and nodded in that distracted way that meant he was already thinking about something else. And Marcus, wearing what I recognized as a $2,000 Tom Ford suit he'd posted on Instagram last week, smirked and said, "Good of you to make the effort, Em. I know getting out of the Richmond is probably a whole expedition." The waiter appeared with water and menus, and I watched him set down the leather-bound folder in front of me, the same menu I'd ordered from dozens of times. Appetizers and entrees I could have recited from memory, and my mother said, "The prices here are quite something. But don't worry, dear. Order whatever you'd like. This is our treat." In that tone that made charity sound like condescension, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, that old hurt mixing with resignation, and I opened the menu even though I didn't need to, stared at the seared scallops appetizer for $32 that I'd had just 6 weeks ago when I'd brought my team here to celebrate closing a major client deal. And I wondered, as I'd wondered so many times before, why I kept showing up to these performances, these dinners, where I played the role they'd written for me, the struggling daughter who'd made poor choices, and my father ordered a bottle of wine without consulting anyone, a Napa Cabernet for $85 that I knew wasn't even the best option in that price range, and I sat there in my simple dress at my usual restaurant feeling like an imposter in my own life, waiting for the evening to unfold in the predictable pattern of dismissal and disappointment that had defined every family gathering for the past 10 years. The wine arrived and my father made a show of tasting it, swirling and sniffing like he was some kind of sommelier, even though I knew for a fact he'd learned everything he knew about wine from a weekend course in Napa 5 years ago. And once he'd approved it with a self-satisfied nod, the waiter poured for everyone, and my mother immediately launched into a commentary about my apartment, how she'd driven through the Richmond last week and had been absolutely dismayed by how far it was from downtown, how the neighborhood seemed tired and lacking in the kind of energy you'd want in your late 20s. And my father added that real estate in the Sunset and Richmond had limited appreciation potential compared to the neighborhoods where successful people chose to live, and I sat there cutting my $48 butternut squash appetizer into smaller and smaller pieces, while Marcus leaned back in the booth and described his recent deal, a luxury condo renovation in Soma that had netted him $150,000 in commission, his biggest single sale this year. And my mother practically glowed as she listened, reaching over to squeeze his hand and tell him how proud they were, how he'd really found his calling, how he had such natural talent for understanding what wealthy clients wanted. My father raised his glass in a toast to Marcus's success, and I dutifully lifted mine, even though the wine tasted like ash in my mouth. And then my mother turned to me with that sympathetic expression I'd learned to dread, and said, "Well, Emma, we can't all close six-figure deals, can we? I'm sure your little computer work is satisfying in its own way." And I felt something crack inside my chest, but I just nodded and took another sip of wine and wished I was literally anywhere else in the world. The entrees arrived and I'd ordered the salmon, $36, a dish I'd had here at least 6 times before and knew was consistently excellent. And my father looked at his $60 ribeye and made a joke about how this was quite the splurge and how he hoped I understood they were treating tonight, that places like Meridian were aspirational for most people my age, and he didn't want me to feel uncomfortable about the prices, and my mother added quickly, "Yes, darling, please don't even look at the check. We know money is tight when you're still establishing yourself." And I wanted to laugh or scream or stand up and walk out, but instead I just said thank you and cut into my salmon, while Marcus smirked across the table and my father launched into a lecture about financial planning and the importance of building wealth in your 20s, looking directly at me the entire time as if I was some kind of cautionary tale about poor life choices. And I realized with a strange clarity that they'd brought me here specifically for this, that this dinner at an expensive restaurant was meant to be an object lesson about the life I could have had if I'd made better decisions, if I'd been more like Marcus, more like them. And I was picking at my salmon and barely tasting it, even though I knew it was perfectly cooked because my throat felt tight and my eyes were starting to burn, and all I could think was that I'd sat at the same restaurant 7 weeks ago with my entire executive team and signed off on an $8,000 bill without even blinking, and here I was letting my parents believe I could barely afford rent. I tried to change the subject when the silence became unbearable, asked my mother how her book club was going and whether the Hendersons were still planning their trip to Portugal, grasping at any topic that might redirect this awful dinner away from my apparent failures. But my mother waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, that reminds me. Marcus just bought the most gorgeous new car, a Mercedes. Tell her about it, sweetheart." And Marcus needed no encouragement, launching into a detailed description of his new S-Class sedan with the premium package and custom leather interior, $68,000, he said with obvious pride. And my parents beamed at him like he'd just announced a Nobel Prize. And my father seized the opportunity to pivot into what I recognized with sinking dread as one of his signature speeches, the kind he'd been delivering my entire adult life, about financial responsibility and making practical career choices and understanding the difference between dreams and reality. And every word was aimed directly at me, even though he kept his eyes on his plate, talking about how some people understood the value of building wealth through proven methods, while others chased fantasies and ended up struggling, and his voice was getting louder with each sentence. That particular volume that meant he was working himself up into righteous certainty, and I could feel other diners starting to glance our way, could see a woman at the next table lean closer to her companion and whisper something, and my face was burning with humiliation. That old childhood shame of being the disappointment, the cautionary tale, the daughter who'd chosen wrong. Marcus was sitting across from me with that expression I'd seen 1,000 times, that barely concealed smirk that said he was thoroughly enjoying my discomfort. And my mother reached across the table to pat my hand in that condescending way she had and said, her voice carrying across the restaurant because she'd never learned to modulate in public spaces, "Well, we can't all be successful, darling. Some people just make poor choices, and that's something you have to accept about yourself. There's no shame in being ordinary." And I felt something inside me start to crack, all those years of swallowing criticism and accepting their narrative about my life. And I was about to say something, maybe finally defend myself, or maybe just excuse myself to the bathroom so I could cry in private, when I saw Alessandro making his way across the dining room toward our table, and my entire body went cold, because I knew him, had known him for 2 years, and I could see from the warm recognition on his face that he was coming to greet me. And in that split second before he reached us, I had time to think that everything was about to change, that the careful separation I'd maintained between my real life and my family's perception of my life was about to collapse, and I didn't know whether what I felt was terror or relief or some complicated mixture of both. And then he was at our table, smiling, and there was nowhere left to hide. My father set down his fork with that deliberate precision that always preceded his most serious pronouncements, and he looked at me with an expression that might have been concern if I didn't know better, if I hadn't seen this exact look accompanied by 1,000 small cruelties over the years. And he said, "Emma, your mother and I have been talking, and we're genuinely worried about your future, about where this technology phase is leading you. And I felt my hands start to shake in my lap because I knew what was coming, could sense the shape of it before the words even formed, and my mother nodded encouragingly at him like they'd rehearsed this. And he continued, "We think it's time you came home, came back to the family business where you belong. We could use someone to help with administrative work, filing, client coordination, basic office management, and we'd pay you a fair salary, 35,000 a year to start. And I know that's not much, but at least you'd have stability, health insurance, a future you could count on instead of this uncertainty." And my mother added quickly, "It would be such a relief to have you close again, to know you were taken care of. And honestly, darling, it's not too late to admit that the whole computer thing just didn't work out the way you hoped. There's no shame in coming back to what you know." And Marcus was watching me with barely concealed amusement, and I realized they'd planned this entire dinner as an intervention, that the expensive restaurant and the criticism and the comparisons had all been leading to this moment where they'd offer me a lifeline back to mediocrity, back to being the disappointment they could at least keep under their roof and under their control. And I was opening my mouth to respond, not sure if I was going to scream or cry, or finally tell them everything I'd been holding back for years, when I saw Alessandro weaving between tables toward us, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled as always, wearing the elegant charcoal suit he favored for evenings in the dining room, and my entire body went rigid because Alessandro knew me, had known me for 2 years as a regular patron, as someone very different from the struggling failure my parents saw. And I caught his eye and saw the warm recognition there, saw him smile that genuine smile he reserved for valued guests. And I had maybe 3 seconds to prepare myself for what was about to happen. 3 seconds to feel the walls I'd built between my two lives start to crumble. And then he was at our table, and my father was still talking about the administrative position and how I should really consider it seriously. And Alessandro's hand was already extended toward me in greeting, and I knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to change, that there was no way to stop what came next. And somewhere beneath the panic, I felt a strange surge of something that might have been relief, or vindication, or just exhaustion at finally being seen. Alessandro's smile was warm and professional as he reached our table, and he said, "Ms. Chen, wonderful to see you again." And I felt my parents' heads swivel toward me in unison, their confusion almost comical if it weren't for the fact that my heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts, and my father's mouth had actually fallen open slightly, and Alessandro continued with that easy courtesy that made him such a successful restaurateur. "It has been too long, I think perhaps 2 months since your last visit. I hope you have been well." And he said it like we were old friends, because in a sense we were. I'd been coming to Meridian regularly since 6 months after it opened, back when I got my first significant promotion and decided I deserved to treat myself to excellent food and wine. And my mother found her voice first, that sharp tone she used when she thought someone was trying to pull something over on her. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. This is my daughter Emma." And the implication was clear in her voice, the unspoken assumption that Alessandro had confused me with someone else, someone who belonged in a place like this. And Alessandro's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his elegant features, and he said with perfect politeness, "No mistake, Mrs. Chen, I presume. Your daughter has been a valued patron of Meridian for nearly 2 years now. One of our regular guests," and he gestured toward the window section of the dining room. "She usually prefers table 7, the corner table with the best view of the city lights." And I could see my father trying to process this information, his face cycling through confusion and disbelief, and Marcus had stopped smirking and was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. And my mother laughed, this sharp, brittle sound that echoed slightly in the suddenly quiet corner of the restaurant, and she said, "That's simply not possible. Emma couldn't possibly afford. I mean, she doesn't. We would have known." And I watched her struggle to articulate what she meant, without saying out loud that they'd assumed I was too poor to eat at restaurants where appetizers cost $45. and Alessandro's expression became more neutral, more professional, and I could see him beginning to sense that he'd walked into something complicated, something family-related and delicate. But he maintained his composure and said, "I can assure you, madam, that Ms. Chen has been a regular guest. We know her quite well here." And there was something in his voice, a subtle emphasis on the "quite well," that made my father sit up straighter. And I found my voice finally, quiet and steady, despite the chaos in my chest. And I said, "It's true. I've been coming here for a while." And my mother's eyes widened, and she looked at me like I'd confessed to something shameful. And the weight of their shock, their complete inability to reconcile this information with their understanding of who I was, settled over the table like a heavy cloth. And I realized that this was it. This was the moment where everything I'd kept separate was going to collide. Alessandro must have sensed something in the air, that particular quality of tension that comes from family conflict, and his expression became more careful, more diplomatic, but he continued with genuine warmth. "I do hope Ms. Chen has told you about the private dining event we hosted for her last month. It was such a pleasure to arrange." And I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what he was talking about. The executive team dinner I'd organized when our company closed our Series C funding round, and I could feel my parents' eyes on me, could sense their confusion deepening into something else, and my mother said, "Private dining event?" with that rising inflection that meant she was trying to process information that didn't fit her worldview. And Alessandro nodded enthusiastically, clearly not realizing he was detonating small bombs with every word. "Yes, Ms. Chen hosted her company's executive team here. A beautiful evening, party of 20 in our private room. They were with us for nearly 4 hours. Wonderful group of people, very impressive." And my father's face had gone through several colors now, settling on a kind of grayish pale, and he said, "Executive team?" And his voice cracked slightly on the second word. And I watched Marcus sit back in his chair like he'd been pushed, his earlier smugness evaporating as he tried to recalculate everything he thought he knew about his failure of a sister. And Alessandro was still talking, oblivious to the earthquake he was causing. "Yes, it was one of our most successful private events of the season. Ms. Chen handled all the arrangements herself, knew exactly what she wanted, the wine pairings, the menu selections. She has excellent taste." And my mother's hand had gone to her throat, that unconscious gesture she made when she was truly rattled, and she looked at me like I was a stranger, like the daughter she thought she knew had been replaced by someone else entirely, and I could see the questions forming in her eyes, the desperate need to understand how this could possibly be true, and Alessandro finally seemed to notice that something was wrong, that the atmosphere at the table had shifted into something heavy and strange, and he said with more hesitation, "I hope I have not spoken out of turn. I assumed, of course, that Ms. Chen had mentioned this to her family." And he looked at me with concern, and I managed to nod, managed to find my voice, though it came out quieter than I intended, and I said, "It's fine, Alessandro. Thank you." And my father cleared his throat, that authoritative sound he made when he was trying to regain control of a situation, and he said, "Emma, what is he talking about? What executive team?" And the weight of that question hung in the air between us, and I knew that this was the moment, the precise instant where I could either deflect and minimize and try to smooth things over the way I always had, or I could tell them the truth, could let them see what they'd been so determined not to see for so many years. I took a breath, and the air felt thin and sharp in my lungs, and I said quietly but clearly enough that everyone at the table could hear, "I'm the Senior Engineering Director at TechVantage Solutions." And the words hung there between us like something solid and undeniable. And my mother's face went through a series of expressions so quickly, I couldn't track them all. Shock and confusion, and something that might have been anger or might have been embarrassment. And my father just stared at me with his mouth slightly open, and Marcus had gone completely still, his earlier smugness evaporating like water on hot pavement, and Alessandro's eyes widened slightly, clearly realizing that he'd just revealed something my family genuinely hadn't known, and he said with obvious regret, I apologize. I assumed, of course, that you had discussed this with your family. I did not mean to overstep. And he started to back away from the table, but my mother's voice stopped him, sharp and demanding. Wait, why wouldn't Emma have mentioned something like that? When did this happen? And I could hear the accusation in her voice, the implication that I'd been deliberately hiding things from them, which was true, but not in the way she meant. And Alessandro hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but also perhaps sensing that he'd already opened this door and might as well continue. And he said with careful diplomacy, "The dinner was last month, March 15th, a Tuesday evening. It was quite an event. Nearly $8,000 for the full service, wine pairings, premium menu selections, and Ms. Chen handled all the arrangements with perfect professionalism." And I watched my father's face as he processed that number, $8,000 for a single dinner. The kind of money he would have assumed I couldn't possibly have access to, and Alessandro continued, perhaps trying to salvage the situation by emphasizing my character. And I must say, Ms. Chen has been extraordinarily generous to Meridian. During the pandemic, when we were struggling to stay afloat, she purchased $15,000 in gift certificates, completely unprompted. It was one of the things that helped us survive those difficult months. And his voice carried genuine gratitude. And I remembered that time clearly, how I'd seen the article in the local business journal about restaurants closing, and I'd thought about Alessandro and his staff, and how much I'd come to value this place, and I'd called him directly and arranged the purchase, told him to use the certificates for staff meals, or give them to healthcare workers, whatever would help most. And my mother made a sound that was almost a gasp, and she said, $15,000? Like she couldn't quite make the words make sense, and my father's face had gone from pale to red, that deep color that meant he was either furious or deeply embarrassed or possibly both. And Marcus was looking at me like I was a stranger, like his little sister had transformed into someone he didn't recognize at all. And Alessandro, perhaps finally understanding the full depth of what he'd stumbled into, gave a small apologetic bow and said, "I will leave you to your family dinner. Again, my apologies for any confusion." And he retreated quickly toward the kitchen. And I was left sitting there with my parents and brother staring at me in this awful silence that felt heavier than anything that had been said earlier. And I could see other diners at nearby tables glancing over with poorly concealed curiosity, and I realized that this was it. This was the moment where everything changed, where I could no longer be the disappointment they'd decided I was, where the truth was out and there was no way to put it back. The silence at our table stretched for maybe 10 seconds, though it felt longer, and I could see my mother opening her mouth to say something when Maria, one of the servers who'd been working at Meridian since it opened, approached our table with a warm smile directed at me, and she said, "Ms. Chen, I'm so sorry to interrupt your dinner, but I wanted to thank you personally." And my parents' heads swiveled toward her with identical expressions of confusion, and Maria continued, "My daughter Isabella started her internship at TechVantage last week, and she absolutely loves it. She calls me every evening to tell me about what she's learning." And she pressed her hand to her chest in that gesture of sincere gratitude. "The recommendation letter you wrote for her. It made all the difference. The hiring manager told her it was one of the strongest endorsements he'd ever read." And I felt my face warm, because I remembered Isabella's application, how bright and eager she'd been during our informational interview. And I said softly, "Isabella earned that internship herself, Maria. I just opened the door." But Maria shook her head emphatically. "You did so much more than that. You spent 3 hours with her helping her prepare for the technical interview. You didn't have to do that." And I could feel my mother's stare burning into the side of my face, and Maria squeezed my shoulder gently before returning to her station. And I'd barely processed that interaction when Richard, the sommelier who'd been at Meridian for 2 years, appeared at the table with a bottle in his hand and his usual professional warmth. "Ms. Chen, wonderful to see you this evening. Shall I bring you the usual Barolo?" And he held up the bottle slightly, the label showing clearly, and I knew without looking that it was the Marchesi di Barolo Canubi, 2015, a wine I'd developed a taste for and ordered regularly when I came here. and my father made a strangled sound because even he would recognize that label, would know it cost somewhere in the range of $300. And Richard was waiting for my answer with patient attentiveness, the kind of service you give to established patrons who are known and valued. And I found my voice and said, "Not tonight, Richard. Thank you. Just water for me." And he nodded with understanding. "Of course. Please let me know if you change your mind." And he moved away smoothly, and I could feel the weight of my family's stares, could sense the other diners at nearby tables, watching our little drama unfold with poorly concealed interest, and Marcus had gone completely pale. His earlier confidence and smugness evaporated entirely, and he was looking at me like he'd never seen me before, like his little sister had been replaced by someone else. And my mother's mouth was opening and closing, but no sound was coming out. And my father had both hands flat on the table like he needed to steady himself. And I sat there feeling this strange combination of vindication and exhaustion, because this was what I'd never wanted, this public revelation, this moment of having to prove my worth through dollars and status and the recognition of others. But it was also deeply, quietly satisfying to watch them realize how completely they'd misjudged me, how thoroughly they'd dismissed someone who'd been succeeding all along right under their noses. And the manager, David, stopped by our table briefly to confirm that everything was satisfactory with our meals, and he addressed me directly with easy familiarity. "Ms. Chen, I hope the sea bass was prepared to your liking." And I nodded, and he smiled and moved on. And each of these small interactions was another brick in the wall of evidence, another piece of proof that I belonged here, that I was known here, that I was respected and valued in a place my parents had assumed I couldn't possibly afford. And I watched my mother's hand tremble as she reached for her water glass, watched my father's jaw clench and unclench as he tried to process everything he was learning, and I felt tired suddenly, bone-deep tired, because vindication wasn't as sweet as I'd sometimes imagined it might be. It was just sad and heavy and final. My father was the first to find his voice, and he cleared his throat in that way he always did when he was trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped away from him. And he said, "Well, Emma, why didn't you tell us about any of this?" And his tone tried for reasonable, but came out defensive. And I looked at him across the table, really looked at him, and I felt something shift inside me, something that had been bent for so long finally straightening, and I said quietly, "I tried to tell you, Dad. I tried so many times." And my mother made a sound like she was about to interrupt, but I kept going because if I stopped now, I might never say these things. "I called you when I got my first promotion 3 years ago. Do you remember what you said? You said congratulations and then spent 20 minutes talking about Marcus's latest property acquisition." And I saw my father's face change, saw him trying to remember, and I continued. "I invited you to my promotion celebration last year when I made senior director, sent you the invitation 6 weeks in advance, and you said you couldn't make it because you had a golf tournament." And my mother's hand went to her throat. "It wasn't even a tournament, Mom. It was a regular Sunday game," Marcus told me later. And I felt my voice wanting to shake, but I kept it steady. "I tried to tell you about the equity package when I got it 18 months ago. I called you specifically to share that news, and you cut me off after 2 minutes to ask if I'd talked to Marcus recently because he'd just gotten engaged." And the memories were coming faster now, sharp and clear. "You didn't come to my graduation from Stanford, either of you. You said it was too far and you were busy with the business, but you flew to Hawaii for Marcus's birthday that same month." And my father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And I could see other diners at nearby tables not even pretending not to listen anymore. "You never asked about my work, because you decided years ago that it wasn't real, wasn't valuable, wasn't worth your attention or respect." And my mother said, "Emma, that's not fair. We just didn't understand." But I shook my head. "You didn't want to understand. There's a difference. You never asked questions, never showed interest, never acknowledged that maybe I knew what I was doing." And I took a breath, and I said, "My salary is $240,000 base, plus equity that's currently valued at around 1.8 million, and I'm getting another grant next quarter. And I watched Marcus physically deflate in his chair, all his earlier pride and smugness completely gone, and my father's face had gone pale again, and my mother was shaking her head like she could make this information rearrange itself into something that made sense with the story she'd been telling herself about her disappointing daughter. And I said, "You never asked, because you'd already decided I was a failure, and nothing I could have said would have changed your mind. So eventually I stopped trying." And the exhaustion I'd felt earlier was mixing with something cleaner now, something like relief, because these words had been sitting inside me for years, and finally saying them out loud made them real and undeniable. My father leaned forward and said, "Emma, sweetheart, I think we've made some mistakes here." And his voice had that placating tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients. And I felt something harden in my chest, because this was the moment where they would try to smooth everything over, try to reset to a version of normal that worked for them. And I realized with absolute clarity that I was done seeking their approval, done trying to make them see me, done shrinking myself to fit into their narrow definition of success. And I said, "I don't want apologies right now. What I want is for you to understand what the last 6 years have cost me." And my mother reached across the table like she was going to take my hand. But I pulled back, not harshly, but firmly, and I continued. "I spent so much energy trying to make you proud, trying to prove that my choices were valid, and every single time you dismissed me, it took something from me. It made me smaller." And my voice was steady now, clear. "I stopped telling you about my life because sharing good news with you felt like handing you ammunition. I knew you'd find some way to diminish it or redirect the conversation to Marcus." And my brother flinched at that, and I looked at him directly for the first time since this all began. "I don't blame you for being their favorite, Marcus, but I do blame you for enjoying my humiliation, for participating in it." And he nodded slowly, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like shame. And my father said, "We didn't know, Emma. If we'd known..." But I cut him off. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know, Dad. There's a difference. You could have asked questions. You could have shown interest. You could have treated my career with even a fraction of the respect you showed Marcus's." And the nearby tables had gone completely quiet, our family drama now the evening's entertainment, and I found I didn't care anymore about making a scene or keeping up appearances, and my mother was crying openly now, mascara running down her cheeks, and she said, "We're still family, Emma. We love you." And I felt my throat tighten because I knew she believed that, knew she thought love alone was enough to excuse years of casual cruelty. And I said, "I know you love me, Mom, but love without respect isn't enough, not anymore." And I took a breath and laid out what I needed with a clarity that surprised me. "If you want to be part of my life going forward, things have to change. No more comments about my lifestyle choices. No more comparisons to Marcus. No more assumptions about my finances or my capability. And you need to actually listen when I talk about my work. Really listen, not just wait for your turn to talk about the family business." And my father started to protest. "Emma, that's not fair to ask us to..." But I held up my hand. "That's not negotiable, Dad. Either you respect my boundaries or we go to minimal contact, holiday cards, and nothing more." And I could see them both struggling with this, struggling with the idea that I was the one setting terms now, that I was the one with the power to decide what our relationship looked like. And Marcus spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice quiet. "She's right, I've been a smug asshole. And you two have treated her like she was failing when she was actually crushing it." And my parents both turned to look at him with shocked expressions, and he shrugged. "I'm just saying what everyone at this table knows is true." And the silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid and realizations unwinding. And I felt exhausted and relieved and sad all at once. Because this was what standing up for yourself actually felt like. Not triumphant, but necessary. Not easy, but essential. Alessandro had retreated during the family confrontation with the discretion that made him an exceptional restaurateur, but now he returned as the silence at our table stretched into something almost unbearable. And he placed the leather folio containing our bill face down on the table between my parents. And my father reached for it automatically with that reflexive gesture of a man accustomed to being in charge. But Alessandro's hand came down gently on top of the folio, and he said, "Actually, sir, this has been taken care of." And my father looked confused and said, "What do you mean taken care of? We're paying for dinner." And he had that edge in his voice like he was trying to reclaim some authority after everything that had just happened. And Alessandro smiled and said, "Ms. Chen's meals are always complimentary. It's our policy for investors." And the word hung in the air like a bell that had been rung, and my mother said, "Investors?" And her voice came out strangled, and I felt something settle in my chest, the final piece of this evening clicking into place. And I said quietly, "I own 15% of Meridian. I invested $200,000 2 years ago when Alessandro was looking to expand." And I watched my father's face go through several colors, and the number sat there between us with all its weight and significance. And my mother whispered, 200,000. And I nodded and said, "The same amount you gave Marcus to start in the family business. I remember that number very specifically." And Marcus was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between awe and regret. And my father said, "You had that kind of money 2 years ago?" And I could hear all the recalculation happening in his head, all the assumptions being forcibly rearranged. And I said, "I had that kind of money 3 years ago, actually. I just waited until I found the right opportunity." And Alessandro squeezed my shoulder gently and said, "Best investment I ever accepted. Ms. Chen has been invaluable with our technology systems and online presence." And then he withdrew again with perfect timing, and I stood up because I was done. Done with this table and this conversation and this whole exhausting evening, and I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet. The same simple wallet my mother had once commented looked worn. And I took out 8 $100 bills and placed them on the table in front of my father, and I said, "That should cover everyone's meals and a generous tip. I've got this one. Family is important after all." And I heard my own words echo back all the times they'd insisted on paying for me with that particular tone of condescension. All the times they'd made me feel like a charity case, and my father started to push the money back and said, "Emma, you don't have to." But I picked up my purse and said, "I want to, Dad. Let me do this for my family." And the word family came out with just enough emphasis that everyone at the table understood I was making a point. And my mother was crying harder now, and Marcus stood up suddenly and said, "Emma, wait." And I paused and looked at him, and he said, "I'm sorry. I mean it. I've been a complete asshole, and you didn't deserve any of that." And his voice cracked slightly, and I nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that." And I meant it, because his apology felt real in a way our parents' scrambling explanations hadn't. And I looked at my mother and father one more time and said, "Call me when you're ready to actually talk. Really talk, not just apologize because you're embarrassed." And then I walked away from that table with my head up and my shoulders back, and I could feel every eye in the restaurant on me, and I didn't care anymore what any of them thought, because I knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. 3 months passed before I truly understood what freedom felt like, and it came not in the dramatic confrontation at Meridian, but in the quieter moments that followed, the gradual rebuilding of relationships on terms I had set. And my parents called exactly 1 week after that dinner, my mother's voice hesitant on the phone saying they wanted to talk, really talk. And we met for coffee at a neutral location, and they listened for maybe the first time in my adult life. And my father admitted he'd been threatened by my choice to leave the family business because he'd taken it as a rejection of him personally, and my mother confessed she'd convinced herself I was struggling because it was easier than admitting she'd been wrong about my career. And these conversations were uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but they were real, and we started having monthly dinners again. But the dynamic had shifted completely. They asked about my work now with genuine interest, They listened to my responses without redirecting to Marcus. And my mother even asked technical questions about software development that showed she'd been reading articles to understand my field better. And Marcus reached out 2 days after the dinner with a long text message that turned into a phone call where he apologized for years of smugness and complicity, and he said watching me walk away from that table had made him examine his own life and realize he'd been coasting on our parents' approval without ever proving himself the way I had, and we met for lunch and talked for 3 hours. And I realized my brother wasn't the villain I'd made him in my head. He was just someone who'd taken the easier path and was starting to understand what that had cost both of us. And rebuilding these relationships was harder than cutting them off would have been, but I decided they were worth the effort as long as the respect remained. And my parents were still learning, still sometimes slipping into old patterns. But they caught themselves now and apologized when I pointed it out, and I found I could be patient with their growth, because I was no longer waiting for their approval to feel worthy. And then last week, my company announced we were going public, and my equity stake that had been theoretical numbers suddenly became very real. $2.3 million real. And I told my parents over dinner, and my father's eyes went wide, but what he said was, "You must be so proud of what you've built, Emma." And my mother asked intelligent questions about the process and the timeline, and Marcus raised his glass and said, "To my brilliant sister." And I felt something tight in my chest finally release, because this was what I'd wanted all along, not their envy, but their genuine pride. And tonight I was back at Meridian, but this time I'd reserved the private dining room for my chosen family, the colleagues who'd supported me and the friends who'd celebrated every victory, and Alessandro brought out champagne and made a toast about backing winners and knowing talent when he saw it. And my best friend Sarah, who'd listened to me cry after countless family dinners, was laughing beside me. And my mentor James, who'd promoted me to senior director, was telling embarrassing stories about my first month at the company. And I looked around the table at these people who had valued me all along, who had never needed proof of my worth because they'd simply seen it. And I felt the weight of all those years of seeking validation finally lift away completely. And through the window, I could see the city lights spreading out like possibilities, and I realized this was what success actually looked like, not the money or the title or even the vindication, but this feeling of being surrounded by people who loved me for exactly who I was. And I thought about that dinner 3 months ago, and how humiliated I'd felt before everything shifted. And I understood now that my parents' inability to see my worth had never been about me at all. It had been about their own fears and limitations, and I'd spent so much energy trying to make them proud when I should have been making myself proud. And I was done with that now. Done shrinking myself to fit their expectations. Done seeking permission to be successful. And Alessandro caught my eye from across the room and smiled, and raised his own glass in a private toast. And I smiled back and felt completely at peace with exactly where I was and who I'd become, finally free.